the faster we get out of this pity narrative that we're in, because it's also now morphing your brain. Like it sounded like you had some great mentors, or you had some just incredible consciousness. Unfortunately, free thinkers are probably more likely in the special operations community than in the conventional force. But let's say free thinkers who are doing an assessment of themselves. If all the rhetoric out there is, and the 45,000 nonprofits in the veteran space are like, you're fucked, you're broken, you're, and it's not. They're all well intended. They're all raising money, I think, mostly for well intended purposes, but they are causing so many problems. They're using broken veterans, which are a small percent of the population, as spokespeople for all the rest of us. And the reality is most veterans are highly competent, highly skilled, great leaders who just want to do awesome, purposeful work. That's the truth. But this society would have you believe that they're all broken, have PTSD, have incredible combat trauma, and need our pity and need our dollars. And oh my God, you're so messed up. And it makes sense psychologically. You look at how they might raise money for puppies that are in adoption puppies and kennels, and they play a sad song, and the puppy's shaking in the cage, and people are like, oh fuck, here's my money, I'll give it to you. And the same thing for veterans. But unfortunately, I think they're doing more damage than they're doing good, because they're raising money. Our own people, mostly run by veterans, by the way, are going to companies like Jockey, and they're putting missing limbed veterans on their ads. And then they're basically saying like, oh, buy our products because we give money to missing limbed veterans. And that makes kids like, I don't want to serve in the military. It makes our parents like, I don't want my kid to go to the Army. It's a national security issue now, so you're doing two things. You're victimizing the entire veteran population, and you're making kids not want to serve. And I think it's a huge problem. And so back to partnership strategy, we at UHP won't give money to any nonprofit in the veteran space that uses pity to raise money, ever.
One of the biggest, I think, challenges of transition is that there's really no process. I remember coming into the Army. I went out of college. I had an OCS contract, but you got to go to basic training before you do that. And so when did that process started? In like April of 2003. And then you go to the recruiter, you go through the process, you go through the delayed entry program. And that whole time you're meeting with the recruiter, they're starting to shape your thought process. I went in October of 2003, you go to basic training for 9 weeks. You go to 14 weeks at OCS. And then you go, I think I had 4 months at the infantry officer basic course, Ranger school, airborne school. But I was in the Army a year and a half, 2 years into this process before I even got to my unit, where they trained my thought process. They really, as you said, indoctrinated me into a mindset, programmed me, right? And then I went and got out. I came back from being General Linder's aide at SOC Africa, said, I think this is it. I got to move on and go do something else. And it was, okay, check in, once a week, let us know you're okay. And I got 4 months to figure out what I was going to do, watching this clock every day.
Yeah.
What am I going to do today to figure out?
Fear and uncertainty building up.
Yeah. Because January 16th, that was it.
Yeah.
I was signing out. And I went in to sign out, and you kind of have say your goodbyes to your unit, and to get that done in about an hour, and
walk out the gate.
Then I went to out processing.
Yep.
And some fine lady who I'd never met before and will never see again, asked me for my ID card and handed me a piece of paper and shook my hand, walked me to the door and said, thank you for your service. And I walked to my car, and I got in the car and I started driving away, because I was like, okay, whatever.
The loneliest look.
And I got out the gate, and I looked in the rearview mirror, and I started crying.
Yeah.
Because I spent 13 years of my life doing this thing, and this thing was now over. But the years that I spent programming myself came down to a woman I never knew shaking my hand in an exchange that lasted about 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Taking my ID card away, and you talked a few minutes ago about your identity. And your identity, lived in that ID card for so long, and someone else took it.
That's so eloquently put. And I think when you combine that with, you seem to have a pretty low ego about your service, which is great. But let's take somebody that has a high ego about their service. They're pulling out the gate, and that's it. I gave you all this, and I'm this. They need to have that because it's who they are. And the combination of that person saying, "Hey, thanks, see ya." A lot of people leave and start to resent. They're like, well, I gave it so much. Why? I would argue a time you realize it gave you just as much as you gave it. But I think resentment can often build. And it's, it's sad. But at the same time, the DOD's responsibility is to build a lethal fighting force. Period. End of story. And if you are no longer part of that fighting force, just like any company you're leaving, like, hey, thanks, appreciate your time. They're not. I would argue that there's a duty, but where does the DOD's duty stop and the VA's start? And that's that gap that we, I think, as veterans who have all felt the gap, need to fill, because I don't think that there's ever going to be. I mean, maybe a de-indoctrination program happens. Eisenhower talked about it at one point, never got built. And I would argue that's what this place is. We are taking veterans from far and wide, bringing them here and slowing them down in a really rural, amazing piece of property with 300 bald eagles and trout in the river and time and space to think about who you are and what you want out of your life and to talk about what you went through. And so maybe the gate walk that you did doesn't have to be so long, because you come here before that gate walk happens. And when you walk out it, you know where you're going, and you also have better perspective on why you served, and not just the hey, thanks, and you're gone. So I think that getting left of the problem and getting into the transition offices and even skills bridge programs where you can come here first and build a strategy, and we can give you awareness that gate walk's coming, and you don't have to cry at the end of it. Although crying is great, so you should do that. But
sometimes you got no choice. That's what's gonna happen.
Hey.
It's the assimilation into the new world.
Yeah.
And that's the gap that has to be closed.
Yeah.
And providing that opportunity is what you're doing here.